Now, it gives me great honor to introduce Congresswoman Donna Shalala and to welcome her once again to NC State University, where she was here last year. She has been generous and kind enough to take time out of her very overwhelming schedule to participate in this conversation. Congresswoman Donna Shalala represents Florida's 27th District and is an advocate for women's rights, civil rights, increased access to healthcare, better education and public schools, and a clean and sustainable environment. She is a granddaughter of immigrants from Lebanon. Congresswoman Shalala was born in Cleveland, Ohio. She received her AB from Weston College for Women and her PhD from Syracuse University. A distinguished educator, she served as president of Hunter College of the City University of New York, chancellor of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and president of the University of Miami. She is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and has been elected 7 national academies, including the National Academy of Medicine, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the National Academy of Education. In 1993, Congresswoman Shalala was nominated by President Bill Clinton to serve as Secretary of Health and Human Services, which created, implemented, and oversaw the Children's Health Insurance Program, currently covering over 7.6 million children. She also succeeded in doubling the budget of the NIH and secured the highest immunization rates in American history. At the end of her 8-year tenure, the longest tenure of any Secretary of Health and Human Services, a Washington Post article described her as one of the most successful government managers of modern times. Congresswoman Shalala has been named one of America's best leaders by US News and World Report in 2005. She received the Nelson Mandela Award for Health and Human Rights in 2010 and was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame in 2011 and has more than 5 dozen honorary degrees. Again, welcome, Congresswoman Shalala. As I said in my agenda, I will turn the time over to Congresswoman Shalala to address us all for about 10 to 15 minutes along general parameters of US-Lebanon relations. And then we'll have a Q&A based on some of the questions you already submitted and perhaps some questions that you will submit as we go along. Congresswoman Shalala.
Hi, thank you very much. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk to all of you. Let me be clear at the offset. I am not an expert on Middle East studies or on Middle East relations. My field is health policy, but I've been deeply involved in issues that involve Lebanon since I've arrived in the Congress. Just this week, as part of my work with the Congressional US-Lebanon Friendship Caucus, I've had conversations with the State Department, with USAID, and the American Task Force for Lebanon. Between the pandemic, Lebanon's economic troubles, the government turnovers, and the tragic explosion in Beirut, Lebanon is facing not just one emergency, but several overlapping issues that are causing the country to face a crisis like we haven't seen in years. Fortunately, Congress is taking a bipartisan approach. I have several colleagues from both parties who have Lebanese descent. Together, we take responsibility for educating members of Congress on these issues. So despite the dysfunction in Washington, we can actually get things done. For example, last year we had some issues with how the administration was handling the assistance to the Lebanese armed forces. So we pressed the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, and the White House National Security Advisor, and we actually got some movement. More recently, following the Beirut explosion, Representative Darren LaHood and I sent a letter to Secretary Pompeo urging that the State Department continue to deploy much needed humanitarian relief for the people of Lebanon. We had a very large number of our colleagues who signed on to that letter with us. In fact, almost 100 of our colleagues joined us and signed on to the letter. We also had support from the leadership of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Appropriations Committee, both of whom have chairs who are very fond of Lebanon and have long ties to a wide variety of civic and political leaders in Lebanon. And just yesterday, we pressed USAID on how they were getting aid to the people of Lebanon and who's receiving that aid. I was personally responsible for helping a group of people from the American Task Force for Lebanon get private aid to Lebanon, over 30 tons of medicines early during the crisis of the explosion in Beirut. So I'm pretty pleased so far with the response, but it's Congress's responsibility to provide oversight, to ask questions, and demand answers, and we're going to continue to do so. But let me emphasize, our efforts have been bipartisan. We work very hard to make sure there's a large number of members of Congress that are joining together to help the Lebanese people. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Congresswoman Shalala. We really appreciate all that you have done. And I know that along with your colleagues in the caucus, you have done amazing work to try to help the people of Lebanon in these very difficult times. And now, if you don't mind, I would like to turn to some of the questions that have been posed. And again, feel free to answer some of them or say, you know, some of these things, it's better to allow other people to answer. So I think I shared some of these questions with you, but I will read them so that our audience can hear them. So the first question is something that a lot of people are thinking about, which is, how can the United States help, if at all, bring stability to the government of Lebanon? And how does that stability, in your mind, impact the rest of the region and the world?
Well, I'm not sure that the United States is going to intervene at that level. What we are going to do is to talk, and through the State Department, is to talk to Lebanese leaders and to talk to the protesters as well. And that's exactly what Ambassador, the Assistant Secretary Shaker is doing. He made a recent trip to Lebanon. He reported back to us that he had talked to both the protest leaders, civic leaders, as well as to the temporary government of Lebanon, and urged them to bring stability to the country. Our responsibility is a humanitarian one, and to continue to send humanitarian aid. For example, I asked specifically about aid to the American University of Beirut and to the Lebanese American University, where the Congress has had long appropriations, because I wanted to make sure that money was getting out. Both of them were very involved in both treating patients as well as some damage to their own facilities. They've released USAID has released the money early. But I think our role is to encourage the Lebanese people and to encourage elections and fair elections, and to encourage them to get rid of, and we have recently identified, the government of the United States has recently identified at least 2 actors that they believe were not contributing to the future of Lebanon. So I think we have to be careful, given our experience of intervening in countries' affairs, but we have to be supportive of the Lebanese as they go through this crisis. We provided $40 million in COVID aid, as well as the current aid we're providing because of the explosion, in supporting the hospitals and healthcare, as well as the millions of dollars that we're providing for Syrian refugees that are in Lebanon as well.
So this leads me to a question that some people have been wondering about, and you kind of raised it a little bit, which is that the United States government has identified a couple of the leadership in Lebanon that aren't necessarily very helpful, to put it mildly, in terms of moving forward with US-Lebanon relations. And I think some people are a little bit more explicit in asking a question, which is there a general consensus? And here, obviously, there could be daylight between the Democratic part, Democratic House majority and, the administration. But is there a consensus, or is there a way of understanding how to deal with Hezbollah as an actor in Lebanon, both as a militia on one hand and as a political party? Because the question has been that Hezbollah has been a stumbling block in allowing for full US-Lebanon relations?
You know, I really can't answer that question. I can say this, that the government officials who have come back from Lebanon have reported that there's anger in the civilian population toward Hezbollah, and that they're picking that up for the first time in a long time. So that's all I can report to you. I ought to be careful here because, again, I'm not an insider, even though I've been briefed by State Department officials and US aid officials. And certainly I know the continuing attitude of the US government towards Hezbollah as not being helpful. But I think that there's some change in attitude by the civilian population towards Hezbollah, but I wouldn't say more than that.
Well, let's move away a little bit from political parties to talk about aid, which is something that you've addressed. And specifically this idea about where should aid be directed, how should it be directed, and how much humanitarian aid is there possible? Because obviously, even before this August 4th explosion, Lebanon was suffering from a massive economic meltdown brought about by the incompetence and corruption. And any aid package was being held up, if you will. So the question is, how is it that humanitarian aid will arrive in Lebanon? What does the United States imagine will allow for that?
Well, we've already sent humanitarian aid through plane loads of humanitarian aid for the people of Lebanon, including medicines for the most recent crisis. We have been supporting two things in Lebanon. One, through the international organizations, through the High Commissioner for Refugees and through UNICEF and other UN organizations. The United States has been a major donor to relief for Lebanon. In addition to that, most of our direct support has been for the Lebanese army in terms of equipment and training. And a very high percentage of the officers have actually been trained in the United States. In addition to that, we have long supported the universities, the Lebanese American University and AUB with scholarship money, and with direct aid through US aid. And over the years, I have helped to secure support through appropriations, even when I wasn't in the Congress, for these universities, because they're such an important part of developing the next generation of leaders for Lebanon.
Okay, so it's here's another question that is perhaps pertaining as well to the humanitarian aid, but also pertaining to US-Lebanese relations, which is the Caesar Act and the sanctions that have been imposed using the Caesar Act. And the question is, can you imagine a scenario when this Caesar Act would be lifted, and what would that be to allow for greater? Go ahead.
Well, if you're talking about the Caesar Act in relationship to Syria and the Syrian government, I don't know of any discussion to lift the requirements of the Caesar Act. Obviously, it has had an impact on the economy of Syria and therefore the economy of the region. Right. But Assad is a killer, a vicious killer, and I don't hear of any discussion to lift that act at this time.
Shifting to a certain extent to American domestic politics and how it will influence the US-Lebanese relations, some of our participants, several of them actually, have asked a question about what would a Joe Biden administration look like in terms of its policy towards Lebanon in particular, but perhaps even towards the Middle East. Do you envision that there will be differences between the current administration's policies and a Joe Biden administration?
You know, we've been pretty bipartisan on Lebanon through Republican and Democratic administrations. And I don't know enough about what he would do about the Russian influence in Syria. I know he wouldn't have abandoned the Kurds, for example. No Democrat believes that we should have abandoned the Kurds to the Turks. And I do think Middle East policy from that point of view will change. But, you know, the feeling about Lebanon and about the Lebanese people has always been bipartisan in the Congress. There are Lebanese Americans on both sides of the aisle. We've always worked together over the years to protect the interests of the diaspora in particular. So for Lebanon in particular, I think that we would continue humanitarian aid and continue to urge the people of Lebanon to vote for stability in the government and to get rid of, if possible, a lot of the corruption. But that involves our partners in the international organizations as well as our European partners who are players here.
Speaking of European partners, it appears that France's president, Macron, has been perhaps the point person in many ways in his Lebanon's relation with the outside world. He has made 2 visits to the country, one in August right after the explosion and one recently at the beginning of September on the eve of the 100th anniversary of the creation of Lebanon as a nation state. And he seems to, between the 2 visits, there appears to be kind of a shift. So a 2-part question that has been asked. One, is Macron, in essence, does he have the blessings of the United States as well as the European Union in terms of negotiating with existing political elites to find a way out of not only the political crisis, but also out of the economic crisis facing Lebanon? And 2, and that's a second part of the question, some have observed that Macron's second visit appeared to soften a little bit his positioning on what Hezbollah needs to do in order and how far they can be included or not included in the future Lebanese government. So I'm kind of curious if you can shed any light on that.
I really can't. I think his visit and what he said and what he's backed off on has been somewhat controversial, but the French have always had a deep interest and a long history with Lebanon, so I'm not surprised that Macron was there. We sent a deputy Secretary of State, Schenker, to Lebanon, who seems to know the players in Lebanon pretty well. So I can't shed light on that.
So from, again, without necessarily speaking with any definite, in terms of any conversation what I'm kind of curious about is there a message that the United States is sending when we send an Undersecretary of State or a Deputy Undersecretary of State versus the President of a country, France, to Lebanon? I mean, it seems to be 2 different levels of diplomatic weight, so to speak, that are being assigned. So I'm kind of curious.
You're talking about the United States versus France.
Yes, ma'am.
No, there's no reason. First of all, we're at the edge of an election, so I would not expect the American president to visit Lebanon. I don't know the extent. I don't think the State Department wants to get that deeply involved at this point in time. I think we want to be supportive of Lebanon. I think we want to provide humanitarian aid and political support for stability in Lebanon. I think we don't want to choose sides. And we certainly don't want to oppose the progressive elements who have been demonstrating, the younger generation that have been demanding change. Those of us that care about that certainly want to be supportive of them. So it's a delicate situation that you're asking about. And I don't see any indication that the United States is going to go in with a heavy hand.
So let's move back to talking about aid, because you have been heavily involved in providing aid to the Lebanese society and government. And I'm kind of curious if, in the process of organizing this and working with various partners, including the American Task Force for Lebanon, if the United States is considering alternative ways to deliver aid beyond the Lebanese government, because part of the problem that a lot of people have, observed, both in terms of the questions submitted, but also publicly, is that there's little faith in the Lebanese government as it is, and therefore aid going to it may not be delivered. And in fact, we had two recent scandals where tea from Sri Lanka and fish from Mauritania was delivered to not the people that needed it, but to allies of the political elites, including the president. So in your mind, how does the United States do two things? One, how do we immediately provide aid, like you said, medicine, food, money for into the hands of the population that most needs it? And two,
Well, first of all, for medicine, it's obviously delivered to the hospitals, directly to the hospitals. That's why we tend to work through international organizations and depend on them to deliver whatever's necessary directly to the population, as opposed to doing things with the government. I do not know, and I did not ask what the delivery system was, other than hearing from the representatives of US-Aid. There is a big US-Aid office in Lebanon, that they were working with international organizations that also had offices in Lebanon. There is a humanitarian delivery system in Lebanon. I saw it when I was there a year ago, and I'm assuming that we're using that existing system. And by the way, what we sent was what was requested by US-Aid officials on the ground, by consultations with the appropriate NGOs as well. But the US has had a lot of experience in the distribution of humanitarian aid. And I'm sure that we will have congressional oversight on that distribution. Excuse me a minute.
Okay.
Keep going.
Okay, so one of the things that, speaking of this aid and what we're talking about, it is estimated that Lebanon needs at least about an injection of about $10 billion in order to get it out of its current economic crisis and to guarantee that the poverty, which is already at 50% for the population, will not get any worse. The question is, where are these funds are supposed to be coming from international donors, but so far they have been held up. Again, where do you see this changing, in the sense in which we're not talking about millions, we're talking about billions here, and that's aside from the money needed to rebuild Beirut and after the damage?
Well, that kind of money could only come from the international financial institutions, and they'll put requirements on Lebanon in terms of transparency. That money would not come directly from the US government, but would come from the international finance organizations for rebuilding. The question is, what kind of requirements will they put on the Lebanese government in terms of transparency and accountability in the process of offering a package? I don't know where those negotiations are at the moment.
Does the United States play any role in those negotiations, or are those independent from the United States government?
They'll be independent from the United States government, though to the extent that we have representatives on the boards of those organizations, we obviously, the Secretary of the Treasury would know what's going on.
Okay. So in terms of the other part of the question, and this is something that people are wondering about, which is the deep structural changes that you yourself said are needed in Lebanon, and the meeting with both the opposition as well as the existing political leadership. The question on a lot of people's minds is, how can the United States support a peaceful transition so that those in the opposition feel like their voices are heard, that anti-corruption legislation and infrastructure is put in. So how can the United States help in that process, if at all?
Well, through diplomacy, through our ambassador and through the State Department, we certainly can urge all the parties, as we always have. But if you're thinking about something stronger in terms of U.S. intervention, I don't see it. And of course, we're in this crazy political time, overwhelmed by our own COVID-19 crisis. So I think you can expect the U.S. to continue humanitarian aid, to continue diplomacy, to work with the NGOs and the appropriate government officials to urge the kind of stability we'd all like to see for Lebanon, and to indicate that the U.S. is prepared to provide financial resources if those issues are resolved. But at the moment, we're not in a position to do that because the political situation has not resolved. Obviously, with our support of the Lebanese army, we're hoping for stability and for a peaceful transition, but we'll have to see how this evolves. It's very much a fluid situation. All I can do is report on my observations and my conversations.
Sure.
But not much more than that.
So let's shift to the diaspora, because you mentioned it, and you yourself are a descendant of Lebanese immigrants, your grandparents and your parents both being Lebanese Americans. And I'm kind of curious, there's a lot of frustration on the part of the Lebanese diaspora, particularly in the United States, but from all across the world where the Lebanese are spread, about watching in horror as the August 4th explosion happened and feeling completely helpless to do anything, both immediately in terms of providing aid, and I'll come back to that question, by the way, in a bit, but also in terms of having an impact, having some sort of impact as a Lebanese diaspora. What some people like to call soft diplomacy, if you will, or people-to-people diplomacy. So I'm wondering if you have any observations about that, some advice about what people can do.
I work through the American Task Force on Lebanon. I work through the organizations of the diaspora that have these kinds of relationships. And I don't think we have an alternative, most of us, to that. I should have observed that for the investigation of the explosion, the United States did send representatives of the FBI to join with the Lebanese to do the investigation. So that we did provide aid from that point of view. We provided expertise.
And so if I hear you correctly, you're saying basically that the one way that people can participate is through the ATFL, or American Task Force for Lebanon, or other diaspora organizations.
Exactly. There are a lot of diaspora organizations who have direct distribution systems and direct ties. And I would urge people, in addition to supporting family members, to work through those organizations.
All right. So we have a couple of questions. One pertains to the Syrian refugee issue. And basically it's saying that Lebanon not only has a political crisis, economic crisis, but it has demographic crisis, because Lebanon is a host of nearly 1.5 million Syrian refugees in a population that is about 5.5 million. That basically means 1 out of 5, or at most 1 out of 6 people, is a refugee in Lebanon. And coupled with obviously the economic and political crises, the question is, how are these refugees going to go back to Syria, if at all? Is there a way to initiate that, to help that? Because obviously, it's a situation that is equivalent to having nearly 30 million refugees descend on the United States almost overnight.
Yes, only if there's security and peace, people will go home. The Syrians I talk to will go home if there's security in their towns and neighborhoods. If they feel like they and their children will be safe, that their schools can get going again. So it really involves some kind of a political settlement that will allow the Syrian refugees to go home. My discussions with the Syrian refugees is that they really would like to go home, even when their towns have been shattered. If there are resources to rebuild their towns, and I think there would be international resources, but first there has to be security and safety before people will go back. You have identified only the Syrian refugees and not the Palestinian refugees. So Lebanon has in the south, as you well know, a very large UNRWA camp, which I taught in very early in my career. I taught English. I taught English to English teachers, to teachers that wanted to teach English, Syrian, Palestinian teachers. So I'm well aware of that huge UNRWA camp there. So, but the Syrians, I think, will have the best chance of going home if we make an effort to rebuild their communities, and if there's a political peace deal that would allow for the safety of their return. Some people have tried to return to some parts of Syria, but not enough. But I think that could be settled by a political settlement. It didn't seem to me that the Syrian families I met wanted to stay in Lebanon.
So you brought up the issue of Palestinian refugees as well, and it is true, Lebanon hosts about 550,000 Palestinian refugees in various camps across the country, including in the south, where obviously you had taught. And I'm kind of curious because here's the politics of the situation is obviously these refugees cannot go back to Palestine because that does not exist. And it appears that it's getting further and further from happening. And the right of return, which many Palestinians hold on to, is being denied in some ways. So the question is that how do you imagine that population ever being able to leave Lebanon, if you will?
You know, I still believe in a two-state solution, and I still will not give up on the possibility of the creation of a Palestinian state. But it will not be in this administration. And obviously with the UAE deal with Israel, support for the Palestinians is waning. But I do think that a Biden administration will try to work something out so that there is autonomy. And I do believe that the Biden group believes in a two-state solution. Certainly the Congress does, both Republicans and Democrats. The vast majority believe in a two-state solution and would like to see one. Again, there's bipartisanship there.
We have a question about the sanctions. You mentioned recently that the United States the US Treasury has sanctioned two officials within the Lebanese government. One is from Amal, his name is Ali Hassan Khalil, and the former Public Works and Transportation Minister, Yusuf Finianos, who's a senior member of the Christian Marada movement, and both have been sanctioned. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this particular action and what do you think what impact it might have on US-Lebanese relations?
You know, I don't know the answer to that question. I do know it took place, and Secretary Schenker indicated that they had done that, but we didn't have a lengthy conversation about the implications for that for US-Lebanese or whether it was strategic in a sense that it was the first step in a series of steps they were prepared to take.
Do you think that you will be able to get a clearer idea of that in future,
I think that there will be, yes, absolutely. And to the extent that there are hearings before House Foreign Affairs, which I don't sit on, we may get a clearer sense of what the strategy is there.
Okay. All right. So finally, I think this is also a question that pertains to the politics, and this is about the United States and Russian roles in the Middle East. It appears, at least for those of us on the outside of the inner workings of diplomacy and high-stake politics, is that the United States has been ceding a little bit of ground to Russia in terms of the Middle East. And some of the questions that that's being asked is about the influence of course, Russia, but also Iran within the region, as the United States appears to be retreating from some of its commitments. You mentioned the Kurds, of course, as one example, but there are other examples one can bring about. So kind of curious how, how is the United States dealing with the Russian increasing role in that? And second, how do you sort of imagine that the United States will create a balance in its relationship to Lebanon and Israel? Because obviously,
this administration has certainly ceded to the Russians those issues. The question is, what will the next administration do? We're so close to the election now. We're within 50 days. Actually, people are going to be voting in the next 20 to 30 days because of early voting in the United States. So we'll have to answer those questions in January, because it really depends on the expectation my expectation that Joe Biden will be the next president. And I do think, though, that a Biden administration will be much tougher on Russia than this administration has been. But to be fair to this administration, in relationship to Lebanon and the bipartisan support of Lebanon, I've tried to join with my colleagues to make sure that we're speaking with one voice when we're speaking to the administration. There are 2 Lebanese Americans in critical positions in this administration, the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And the Secretary of State himself is very fond of Lebanon. Even though I have disagreements with this administration about foreign policy in general and their management of foreign policy, particularly in Latin America, I sit in Miami. In terms of attitudes towards Lebanon, we do have friends at the highest levels of this particular government. And don't interpret that, by the way, as my suggesting that you vote for Donald Trump. Because at the end of the day, I really am a Democrat.
all right. Well, we would like to thank you. I know you have another thing coming up fairly soon, and we want to thank you for taking the time with us to be here. If I may turn my attention, for those of you who are joining us on chat, I just shared with you the address to our website. And if you go there, you will find that we have a project, as I said, and I will share that with you in just a second. Share screen here. All right, so you will be seeing now the screen of our website, which is lebanestudies.ncsu.edu. And I would like to bring your attention to this project called Recollecting Beirut. And again, it's a project that is meant to allow you all who are related to Beirut in one way or the other to participate in sharing your thoughts about the impact of August 4th explosion and anything else you'd like to say. There's a form there, or you can contact us directly. We also have a list of things that you can do for Lebanon. As Congresswoman Shalala was very kind to note, there are many organizations that have been trying to send support for Lebanon. These are just few of them. We are simply putting them up there. It's, invite you to check them out and see what you need. I do know that the Lebanese Red Cross has more than enough share of donations. I don't think they need any more, because they usually generally tend to work on the immediate crisis. There are a lot of other crises that are unfolding right now that need your help. So please, if you are so inclined, do visit this and do try to help in any way you can. Again, thank you very much, Congresswoman Shalala, for taking the time.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
And we really appreciate it.
Thank you. And I enjoyed visiting the center when I was at North Carolina State.
Well, we enjoyed having you here, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you, everyone, and we wish you a good day.